Hello, this is Scott Turner, and I'm Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars. And welcome to The Week in Science for the 22nd of May, 2025. Today, we're going to start on a hopeful note on the capacity of philanthropy to step in and fund research the federal government increasingly seems disinclined to do. Next, we'll look at an update for a paper published 2 years ago that seemed to show that all the money we spend on science is not producing discovery at the rate we've all been promised. We also have some real science to talk about a remarkable fossil bed in Alberta and how it's giving us some pretty interesting insights into the ecology and biodiversity of the late Cretaceous. And we end with a heartwarming story about the uncertain fate of the climate scam world. Okay, let's jump in. Everyone is pretty gloomy lately about government funding of science being cut back. But before everyone starts flinging themselves off cliffs, let's remember the government is not the only source of funding. Prior to 1950, government funding of university science was very sparse. Back then, most academic research was funded by institutional funds or private philanthropy. It was a pretty good system, actually. Pre-war basic science was a pretty vigorous place. After World War II, governments had a bright idea. What if government funded university science? More money would give us more science, right? Which gives us our present system, where government is now the dominant funder of university science. Institutional and philanthropic funding is relegated to a comparatively minor role now, supporting about 10 to 20% of the total. So, when academic scientists are panicking over cutbacks in federal support of basic science, what's wrong with going back to philanthropy? Well, here's the trouble. Science is presently so locked into government funding that it's inconceivable to many that science can be done without that $100 billion of annual government subsidies. No wonder people are panicking. Which brings me to this article in this week's Nature magazine. It's by Cynthia Friend, who is president and CEO of the Kavli Foundation, which, in its own words, identifies potentially transformative ideas and catalyzes opportunities that unlock the benefits of science to create lasting impact for science and society. Sounds pretty good. She makes two arguments. First, that philanthropic funding could be a better way to fund basic science than the current system of government research grants. Anyone who's ever applied for a research grant from the NSF or NIH knows the grind that's involved. It's been estimated that writing grant proposals accounts for about 40% of a typical scientist's efforts. And there's a pretty low likelihood that the effort will pay off with an actual research grant. Friend argues that private foundations can put money into the hands of scientists doing cutting-edge work much more quickly and efficiently than government can. Private foundations might have a higher risk tolerance than governments typically do. I've had some experience with this, and she's certainly correct on both points. She makes a second, and to my mind, a far more interesting point. One of the concerns with private philanthropy is that foundations will only fund research that aligns with the donor's interests. That would just be jumping from the pan into the fire. If you want to fund basic research, donors have to front the money, then back off. And can they be trusted to do that? Donors have to remember that the money is buying intellectual freedom for the scientist, not hitching the scientist to a donor's pet interests. That can be a problem, particularly when the donor is very wealthy, or, as is often the case with the very wealthy, has a big ego to stroke, and we all know who they are. To guard against that, Friends suggests that philanthropies bind together in consortia. Not only will there be more money available, but it will ensure that one donor doesn't dominate the scientist's work. Finally, philanthropic consortia can enable small foundations to band together, increasing their impact and influence on the research funding landscape. So, buck up, buckaroos. There's a bright future lurking out there in the past. Next up is this article, also in this week's edition of Nature magazine. It explores an issue that's been floating around in the world of science for just about 2 years now. Namely, are we getting what we're paying for with the nearly $200 billion we sink into scientific research every year? We're promised returns in that spending in the form of new discoveries and innovations. We've been testing that premise for about 75 years now. Since 1950, government funding for science has been increasing exponentially, doubling about every 7 years. This means that we're presently spending 11 times more money than we did in 1950. Hence the question, are we getting 11 times more science out of this? 11 times more discovery? As crude as that calculation sounds, that's precisely the logic that has been driving those exponential and never-ending increases of research funding. But rarely has it been asked, is it true? Until 2 years ago, nobody had a good answer to that question. And that's when these authors, Michael Park, Aaron Leahy, and Russell Funk, asked the question in a way that could actually be tested. They developed an index called a Consolidation Disruption Index, or CD index, which uses citation analysis to assess how disruptive a paper was, meaning did the paper change patterns of citation. Papers and patents with high CD scores were thought to indicate breakthrough papers that changed the field. Discovery, in a word. So they calculated CD indices for nearly 45 million papers and about 4 million patents from the 1950s to the present. And this enabled them to test a hypothesis. If more funding is actually increasing scientific discovery, you would expect a rising CD index over time as funding levels increased. And to everyone's disbelief, their results showed a decreasing CD index over time. In fact, if you lay the exponential increase of funding against a pattern of decrease of disruptive papers, they're virtually the mirror image of one another. So, according to Park et al.'s data, more funding is actually producing less of what we supposedly are paying for when we fund research, namely discovery of new knowledge. Well, needless to say, that threw everyone into a panic. To quote one source in the current Nature article, quote, scientists looked at that and said, oh my God, if this is the case, people are going to start to put their money into other things, close quote. It couldn't possibly be true, or otherwise our funding will be jeopardized, and that will be very, very bad. The current Nature article revisits that whole controversy and provides a report on how it's going 2 years later. The good news, or maybe the bad news, depending upon your perspective, is that every alternative explanation for the Park et al. Results has not stood up. It's held up for both cutting-edge and well-established fields. Maybe the low-hanging fruits had already been discovered, and science was just getting harder. That explanation didn't stand up either. Maybe it was an artifact of evolving standards of metadata, things like citations, keywords, and so forth. Well, nope, that didn't stand up either. Or maybe the CD index just didn't measure discovery very well. But other assessments yielded similar declines in disruptiveness. So it looks like the phenomenon uncovered by Funk et al. Stands up. More spending is not getting us more discovery. The decline in disruptive papers over time is real, not only on the basis of the Park et al. Paper, but also on emerging anecdotal evidence that maybe they're right after all. So we seem to be emerging from the denial stage of the crisis to a more constructive dialogue. If our funding is not promoting more discovery, maybe we should rethink how we fund science. The Nature magazine article goes into this in some depth. So, for example, maybe our system of relatively short-term grants awarded on the basis of very detailed grant proposals is not the best way to fund discovery. So, for example, to compete for funds, we force scientists onto an endless and cumbersome quest for grant money that, by some accounts, requires as much as 60% of a working scientist's time writing proposals and administering grants. When you fold into this the low likelihood of a proposal being funded, it's hard to think of a more inefficient and wasteful way of promoting discovery. Maybe scientists are just left too exhausted by the grants proposal treadmill that they have no energy left for creative work. That makes sense to me. Once I had a funded proposal, I avoided writing more proposals like the plague it is. The Nature article goes on to outline some reform proposals, some of them actually counterproductive to discovery. So, for example, the trend in most national science programs is to encourage scientists to enter into coalitions with other scientists, supposedly on the grounds that many minds are more likely to be more creative than the single scientist. The problem there is that discovery is more likely to come from individual scientists or collaborations of, at most, small groups of scientists. The bigger the collaboration, it seems, the more behaviors like crowd following and conformity prevail. So this means that collaborations are discovery killers. There's also a political angle to all this. As inefficient and counterproductive as our current systems of science funding are, these systems do have constituencies that are sometimes politically very powerful. For example, proposals for innovation science programs are cropping up in various countries throughout the world, but these remain small compared to the standard, inefficient, and wasteful system of large-scale grant funding. If we are serious about reform, innovation science should be the norm, not the exception, but it remains the exception. Some places, like in New Zealand, for example, they're doing away altogether with the cumbersome peer review process for grant proposals that now apply. Okay, well, that's a step in the right direction, but really, it doesn't go far enough. In its place, they propose a lottery system, where grant proposals that pass some minimum theoretical threshold for fundability are awarded then by lottery. Well, peer review has itself already given us the equivalent of a lottery, that 25% chance of actually having a proposal funded. So we'll have to see where that goes. What seems clear is that our system right now has not produced discovery, but has instead produced a science funding system that is overly bureaucratic, wasteful, and that incentivizes the production of a lot of trivial or even fraudulent science. And it's long past time to change it. The BBC is soon to release a new series about some remarkable dinosaur finds in Alberta at a site known as Pipestone Creek. What's remarkable about this particular site is the density and diversity of fossil dinosaurs. It's a bone pile of tens of thousands of dinosaur fossils. It's shedding light on the ecology of dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous period. Most of these fossils are herbivorous dinosaurs that moved in large herds. something like the hoofed mammals of today. Think of the antelope migrations in the Serengeti, or the buffalo herds of the American West, and you get an idea of the nature of these large dinosaur herds. These dinosaurs apparently migrated north and south seasonally, following the rains and growth of the grass that followed the rains. The fossils in the Pipe Creek Formation were one of those migrating herds apparently trapped by a very violent flash flood. It not only killed them in large numbers, but covered them quickly with sediment, helping to preserve them. The BBC series is part of the Walking with Dinosaurs series. The BBC Natural History Unit, which consulted on this series, generally tries to get the science right. What makes this series remarkable is not some naturalist talking into a camera, but the use of quite sophisticated CGI animation to reconstruct the environment and behavior as much as it can. And the Pipe Creek fossil bed provided lots of raw data to feed into those CGI animations. Scientifically, what's really interesting about the Pipe Creek bed are the raw data it yields. Usually, fossils are quite rare finds. Many dinosaur species have been characterized on the basis of just single specimens, or even single bones from a specimen, and that's no way to build a taxonomy. What the Pipe Creek Formation does is sample from a population of dinosaurs so that you can assess important things like variation within the herd, differences in morphology, and proportions of different species in the community. An abundant fossil from here came from a relative of the Triceratops, known as Pachyrhinosaurus. There are probably thousands of these individuals fossilized at Pipe Creek that provide essentially a snapshot of an entire population. And from those large numbers, paleontologists can calculate reliable statistics for these dinosaurs, including average body size, say, but as important, statistical measures of variance. Pretty cool. The series begins streaming on the BBC on the 25th of May, and in the United States, the series will be available on PBS beginning June 16th. Let's end on a positive note, provided by the recent edition of the British magazine New Scientist. The positive spin was inadvertent, by the way. The COP30 Green Summit is 6 months away, and no one seems to be doing anything to make it come off. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. This is an annual event that's part of the Paris Climate Accord. All the parties, that is, the signatories for the Paris Accord, get together once a year to see how things are going. And the 30 means that it's been going for 30 years now. The COP conferences have long been a bit of a standing joke. This year, about 50,000 delegates will be flying into Brazil, many of them on private jets. Just imagine the carbon footprint of that. The COP conferences are intended to implement the climate goals laid out in the Paris Climate Accord. If they were effective, the world would have checked by now the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. But now, 30 years on, the world is on track actually to blow past that limit. COP has been a failure, in other words, but like a zombie, it just keeps shuffling on. So the organizers of COP are in a little bit of a panic. The conference is just 6 months away, and it seems very little has been done to pull it off. The organizers have yet to settle on a venue for the conference, for example, so that's a problem. There's another problem. One of the main agenda items is to review and approve so-called NDCs, or Nationally Defined Contributions of Carbon Emissions. Countries are supposed to have a plan in place to define how they intend to reduce carbon emissions, usually a plan to get to net zero by 2050. With 6 months left, very few countries have submitted NDCs to the COP30 conference. Oh dear. Nobody's taking their NDCs seriously, it seems. At least not seriously enough to, actually submit one. There's a simple reason for this. The Paris Climate Accords are not about climate or CO2, they're about money. China, for example, is the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, and it's becoming more so every year. They keep promising strong NDCs, but they never have delivered, nor do they intend to. Namibia, in contrast, has been an enthusiastic participant in the COP conferences. But Namibia contributes only 0.003% of worldwide carbon emissions to the atmosphere. So, whatever action Namibia takes will have negligible effects on the global atmospheric carbon budget. The reason, you see, is that what matters is the money, not the climate. Namibia rakes in hundreds of millions of dollars of green cash, nearly all of it from taxpayers in the industrialized countries of the Northern Hemisphere. Then there's that embarrassing problem of the oil-producing countries. 2 years ago, COP28 was hosted by Dubai, one of the largest petroleum producers in the world. Those hosts were lavish in their promises, but so far, there's been no action. That's because the COP conferences are not about climate, they're about money, and it would be too expensive for Dubai to actually cut back on fossil fuels, And Brazil, the host country for COP30, is the 8th largest petroleum producer in the world. So we can all rest easy and sit back and watch the performance play out. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, it would take a heart of stone not to laugh. Okay, that's it for the Week in Science for May 22nd, 2025. The Week in Science videos sit on the National Association of Scholars YouTube site. There's a lot of other content there, so pay us a visit. And visit us also on the National Association of Scholars website at nas.org. If you enjoyed this, consider joining us as a member. And if you're already a member, thanks for your ongoing support. Until next week,